Welcome back to the Golden State with Mates post-game live. First one we've done in a while here. Thought I'd jump on after Game 5 of the NBA Finals where the Oklahoma City Thunder have taken a 3-2 lead over the Indiana Pacers with a 120-109 victory. Back and forth second half, but the Thunder controlled the game for the majority and an excellent push there in the fourth quarter after the Pacers had closed the gap to just 2. It was on track for a pretty shocking comeback from the Pacers, who, it must be said, like, I admire their grit, their determination, their hustle, all that stuff, but you commit 22 turnovers and your star player has 0 field goals in the game, you simply cannot win. Like, you just cannot win that game. And the fact you could say that, hey, Jalen Williams goes for 40, Tyrese Halliburton goes for 4, there's a 36-point gap between those two players, and yet the Pacers were only down 2 early fourth quarter. That's quite shocking to say, let alone you add in the 22 turnovers as well. So just a wildly poor performance from Tyrese Halliburton, it must be said. I know he's dealing with injury for sure, but geez, 4 points, 0 of 6 shooting. I think he was a minus 13 in the game, had multiple turnovers. I don't know, like, he's just got to be better, and this could come back to bite him because, yes, he's a very young player, don't get me wrong, but it's not every day you're in the NBA Finals, and you might look at it and say, well, I've still got a 10, 12-year career to come. I can get back to this point. That's not always the case. It's hard to get here, and when you get here, you got to capitalize on it, and he will be very, very disappointed with his performance in this game, in a game that really the Pacers could have actually won. Again, like, they found themselves in the game. They got some brilliance out of TJ McConnell in the third quarter. Siakam was good. He had 28 points. Obi Toppin provided something offensively off the bench as well. And you look at it and you think, well, if Halliburton even just has an average game, like, he doesn't even have to play well, just an average game, then they probably win that one and they have a chance to go back to Indiana and win an NBA championship on Thursday. Alas, they're going to be trying to avoid elimination, but there's no such thing as really elimination in the NBA Finals, obviously. They're going to try and avoid the Thunder being able to lift the trophy on their home floor and try and force a Game 7 back in OKC on Sunday, which, of course, I think as neutral fans, I've said it all along, I'll be hoping that we get a Game 7 and that Game 7 is a close one. Just want to, again, before I finish up here on this Game 5 Finals reaction, huge credit to Jalen Williams, man. What a 3-level scorer. 40 points, 14 of 25 shooting, 3 of 5 from 3-point range, gets to the free throw line as well, 9 of 12. It's not that long ago that we saw Jalen Williams as legitimately like a comparative player for Jonathan Kuminga, even though, like, Kaminga is obviously a year further into the system. They're both about the same age, though, and those two guys were kind of seen as similar type players, like 6'7" forwards kind of thing, athletic, could really put the ball in the basket. It doesn't feel that long ago that we were arguing, there was probably a point, I would say maybe 18 months ago, that you could argue you'd take Jonathan Kuminga over Jalen Williams, and now it's not particularly close, and I'm not saying that's all Kuminga's fault. Obviously, there's a part of this in terms of the Warriors and Steve Kerr and all that. And it's also like Jalen Williams just being far better and far more impressive than what we predicted him to be. And it's such an envious position if you're another team looking at the Thunder, seeing a squad who has the MVP in Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and then has a second young guy who's just 3 years into his career who can go for 40 points in a crucial Game 5 of the NBA Finals. Oh, man, and that's not even to start talking about Chet Holmgren and all their other young guys. They've got plenty of draft picks to come. This is danger signs for the league. But again, in saying that, I think whenever there's a new champion born, we said this about the Nuggets a couple of years ago, it looks like there could be a dynasty on the horizon, and then it never really materializes. I think we talked about it with the Celtics as well, looking at Tatum and Brown still being in their prime. We thought, geez, how many championships can the Celtics win? Well, of course, Tatum, unfortunately and devastatingly, tears his Achilles. So that kind of potential dynasty gets thrown out the window pretty quickly. So again, if you're the Thunder, you got to capitalize on this situation. You've been the best team, I think, in the league all season. and certainly the best team in the West. And I expected them to win this series. I am surprised that it's still going. I predicted a 4-1 victory for the Thunder, but now they can try and close it out in Game 6, knowing they have a Game 7 back at home in their back pocket if needed. All right, let's get on to a little bit of Warriors off-season chatter here. I'm going to start with, I want to go through a report today from Michael Scotto of Hoops Hype, who had a little bit of intel on quite a lot of stuff around the league and mentioned a little bit about Jonathan Kuminga as well. So I just wanted to kind of touch base here and provide an update and talk about the latest on Jonathan Kuminga. This is a quote from Scotto in the piece. Says Kaminga is looking for an expanded and consistent role moving forward. Obviously, we know that. The Chicago Bulls and Miami Heat are two teams to monitor as potential sign and trade candidates for Kaminga, league sources told Hoops Hype. With that in mind, the Warriors have also not ruled out the possibility of retaining Kaminga, sources said. He also added that Kaminga is a fallback option for the Heat if they miss on Kevin Durant. Obviously, they are in the mix for him right now, along with the San Antonio Spurs and Houston Rockets. They're the three preferred destinations for KD. Obviously, Minnesota are trying to get involved in that as well, but we had Shams come out earlier and suggest that KD's got no interest in teaming up with Anthony Edwards and joining the Minnesota Timberwolves. And, of course, a fallback option. Kuminga's a fallback option for the Heat if they don't get Giannis as well, which I think it looks increasingly likely that Giannis will probably stay at the Bucks, which, again, from a Warriors standpoint, when you're looking at these big names like KD and Giannis, the best result is them either, if you're Giannis, staying in the East and staying with Milwaukee, and if you're KD, the best case scenario is probably for him to go to Miami, as much as that may complicate the situation with Kaminga somewhat, and that we've kind of got to wait now for the KD thing to be resolved before we potentially see what happens with Kaminga. And as frustrating as it might be to see the Heat flip Andrew Wiggins for KD, given that the Warriors tried to do that very move essentially before the midseason deadline. They wanted to flip Wiggins and stuff for KD, couldn't do it. Now the Heat seem like they're going to try and flip Wiggins and stuff for KD. As frustrating as that might seem from a Golden State standpoint to see the Heat pull that off, I think KD going to the East would be much more beneficial to the Warriors than him staying in the West, going to a Houston, a San Antonio, a Minnesota, whoever it may be, and therefore the Warriors having to see KD more times during the regular season and potentially earlier in the playoffs as well. So hopefully Giannis, if he's not coming to the Warriors, stays with the Bucks, and KD, I think the best case scenario would probably be Miami, or, I mean, if we're looking at other teams that have been linked to KD, probably Toronto. Like, if he goes to Toronto, that'd just be weird, and I'm not sure any neutral rival fans would be too worried about the Raptors necessarily, or at least teams in the Western Conference, that's for sure. So in terms of the potential, let's say KD goes elsewhere and doesn't go to Miami, Giannis doesn't go to Miami, and they're interested in Kuminga. Obviously, we've discussed the potential of Kuminga going to Miami for Wiggins potentially. Now, again, the complications around that with 50% outgoing salary. Wiggs makes like 27, 28 million next season or whatever else. So it could work. Now, again, I've spoken about it before. Would you do like Kuminga and Moody for Wiggins? I don't know. I probably wouldn't, if I'm being honest. I don't know. I like the... I know it's weird to say, but I still like the potential of Kaminga. Like, I still think we saw, obviously, over those last 4 games of the playoffs, averaging over 24 points, very efficient shooting against Minnesota in the second round. It's just hard for me to give up that kind of player for anything less than, I don't know. I'm still looking at this and thinking, what level of player do you need to get? Is Wiggs good enough when you also have to give up Moses Moody in the process? I don't know. Now, I think if the Warriors had the option of obviously trading Kaminga for Jimmy Butler at the midseason deadline instead of Wiggins, then they probably would have done that. They probably would have included Kaminga rather than Wiggs, but obviously with the salary at that point, it didn't work out. Wiggs was okay for Miami across the final part of the regular season, and then was pretty terrible for them during the playoffs, but I'm not going to hold that too much against him. The whole team was terrible against the Cavs in that first round. We know what he can do in the Warriors system, so it's obviously not like you're going to be taking a risk there. We know that he can be that 3-and-D guy who can play alongside Steph and Draymond. And I think as a third guy, next to Steph and Jimmy, I think he'd actually be quite solid. But again, do you risk losing the upside of Kaminga in that scenario? Obviously, you could probably argue Kaminga's a more talented natural scorer than Wiggins is at this point of his career, because Wiggs has kind of jumped into this like 3-and-D more off-ball role. But that's not necessarily what the Warriors like need in terms of Kaminga. Like, that's why the fit is so difficult, because then he needs the ball in his hands. It's why he was benched across the final part of the season before the Steph injury, where obviously the Warriors then did need an on-ball creator, an on-ball scorer to try and make something happen in that second round series against the Timberwolves. So the Warriors do need like more 3-and-D types. And so Wiggins, we know like that he would fit that mold. But again, is he enough of an upgrade from Moses, for example, who had kind of stepped into that Andrew Wiggins role, after the trade in February? Moody and Kaminga for Wiggins, I don't know. I feel pretty meh about it. Like, it's not really moving the needle enough for me, but I could see why the Warriors would do it. I do. In terms of Chicago, this is the one that gets me really, really nervous, because if I see a trade of Jonathan Kuminga to Chicago in a sign and trade, and the best thing the Warriors are getting back is Nikola Vucevic, I'll probably stop supporting the franchise. Like, it would be absolutely disgusting. And that's what has been mentioned a couple of times now. I know it's been mentioned previously, and now Scotto in his report mentioned Vucevic as a potential target. And in fact, I'll read you what he said. It was last season, Golden State expressed interest in trading for Bulls center Nikola Vucevic, now entering the final year of his contract, worth $21.48 million. With the Warriors in a win-now mode, Vucevic's durability, scoring, shooting, and rebounding are all traits that would appeal to Golden State. Chicago's roster has gotten younger, and Kaminga, who turns 23 in October, would fit their timeline better than Vucevic, who turns 35 in October and wants to win now, ideally. That'd be such a bad deal. If the Warriors turn Jonathan Kuminga and his potential and talent into Nikola Vucevic, who's again about to be 35 years old, that's so underwhelming. That's horrible. Like, you run out of things to describe how poor that would be. And I think I would speak for the majority of Warrior fans who I think would be totally against that particular move. So look, I like the idea of Vucevic. If you go back to previous podcast episodes, live streams before the mid-season deadline, before the whole Jimmy Butler thing materialized, and I was for Vucevic, and part of that was because I wanted to see something different. The team was stagnating, lacking any kind of offensive juice or any creation or stuff like that. And I thought just having the idea of a stretch five out on the floor who could knock down 40% from three, who could be a strong rebounder for you, it was just something different to the kind of boredom that I was experiencing before the trade deadline, where the Warriors were really struggling and they were quite, I don't know, it just wasn't exciting. It was unexciting, and fortunately things turned with the Jimmy Butler trade, but it looked like for a while that the best they might be able to do was kind of add that space, that spacing center in Vucevic. Obviously they got that anyway with Quentin Post, which I think going into this offseason, we heard on the latest episode of the Warriors Plus Minus podcast how the Warriors might not actually be going after a veteran center, a stretch five, that they, Tim Kawakami mentioned how they might be leaning more into Quentin Post here moving forward into next season, which I've spoke about, I think is a huge risk for a want-to-be contender to take, to place great faith in a young center who is coming off a rookie season where he was very impressive, don't get me wrong, but whose impact in the playoffs was incredibly limited. And so from that perspective, do you look at Vucevic in a Kaminga sign and trade? No, absolutely not. I'd much rather you look at free agency, where the recent Steven Adams contract, I think, does complicate matters a little bit here. Steven Adams just got a 3-year, $39 million extension with the Houston Rockets over the weekend, which means a couple of things for the Warriors. First of all, it takes Steven Adams off the free agency market and as a potential target for Golden State and other teams like the Lakers, the Suns, teams that are in need of a center. Takes Steven Adams off, which obviously, after that first round series, I think all of us as Warrior fans actually gained a huge amount of respect for Steven Adams, not just in the way that he plays and obviously his ruggedness and his fight, his strength on the glass, his screen setting, all that different stuff. Like, he was fantastic, and you could argue that he probably should have played more for Houston, or you could argue from a Houston perspective that he should have played more in that first round series. Obviously, they lost in 7, but he led the team in plus minus during that series. And, not just, again, the way he played on the floor, but the way he kind of carried himself on the floor and off the floor as well. Like, there was that press conference, I think, after game 4 or game 5, where he was kind of, the media was trying to bait him into a controversial Draymond Green take in terms of Draymond's antics out on the floor and some of his plays. And Steve Adams said, it's just playoff basketball. These things happen, and offered a very diplomatic response, which I think Warrior fans really respected, rather than using it as an opportunity to try and have a go at Draymond, but in some way. So I think a lot of Warrior fans came away from that series thinking Steven Adams, great guy, good player, veteran presence. We could really do with that next season. Now, that's obviously not going to happen now that he's signed this extension. And secondly, and I think probably more importantly, because I looked at Steven Adams and thought that, okay, maybe an upgrade on Kevon Looney, but still not really an offensive threat by any means, aside from offensive rebounding. But he does, this extension, I think, does set the market, set a precedence that is pretty dangerous here in terms of the Warriors being able to acquire a veteran big man, even if they are interested. So if you're Brook Lopez, who's been linked prominently to the Warriors basically since they were eliminated, if you're Al Horford, for example, who I want to speak about a bit more in a second, if you're Clint Capella, who, again, I'm not sure the Warriors are going to be interested, but other teams are. Like, if you're any of these notable veteran centers in the league, I think you're probably looking at Steven Adams and thinking, well, if he's getting $13 million a year average, I want at least that, or around that at least. Like, I want somewhere upwards of $10 to $12 million, rather than, I think there's a few of us and maybe optimistic Warrior fans. Like, I was hoping that Brook Lopez might be available on the taxpayer mid-level exception, like $5.7 million or less, like a minimum even. And then looking at Adams' contract, it suggests that, hey, maybe that's not necessarily the case. Maybe some of these guys like Lopez, like Al Horford, like Clint Capella, other veteran centers, they're probably going to be still looking for more like that 10 to 12, upwards of that $1 million per season, rather than, again, the taxpayer middle level exception, which a lot of teams are going to be trying to utilize at 5.7 mil or something less than that. So that's a bit of a problem. Again, even if the Warriors did want to add a veteran center this offseason, which I think they should, but it sounds like they don't, again, based on Kawakami's comments on the Warriors Plus Minus podcast. If they want to do that, it might have to be via a trade, which, again, brings all kinds of risks depending on what you're sending out. And obviously, if we wanted to do a Kaminga sign and trade for Vucevic, I think me and a lot of other fans would say, well, that's just completely not worth it whatsoever. So I don't know. I still think the Warriors should be targeting another center option to at least have the flexibility there to say, okay, if things don't work out with Quentin Post, if we don't get the development out of him, if we don't get the development out of Trace Jackson-Davis, then we've got an alternative there who is proven, whether that's Brook Lopez or someone else. Al Horford, again, I'll mention him a bit more in a second. But in fact, let's get on to Al Horford now, because Scotto also wrote in his piece that high-level playoff contenders are monitoring Horford to see if he'd leave Boston, with the Celtics expected to take a step back without Tatum next season and in a financial crunch regarding their salary books. And also mentioned that the general sense around the league and those close to Horford is that he'll continue to play next season. He is nearly 40 years old, deep into his career. Look, the Warriors can grant, like, if there's a player that I could see taking a minimum or taking the taxpayer mid-level, who might actually be worth more than that, but at this point of his career, like, I think Al Horford is a guy that would be willing to take less to find himself on a championship contending team and still with a prominent role. And that's two things the Warriors could potentially give him that the Celtics can no longer give. Like, obviously, I think the general thinking would have been that, hey, Al Horford's going to, retire as a Celtic, finish his career in Boston. But again, the Tatum injury, the uncertainty surrounding their payroll, the uncertainty surrounding their ability to compete next season and win a title, like, the Warriors, I don't think, are going to enter next season as the strongest of contenders. Like, they're not going to be that tier 1 contender by any means, unless we see a huge trade here or something. But I still think they could be more relevant than the Celtics, because the Celtics are dealing with the huge, devastating injury to Jason Tatum. So that gives the the incentive for Horford to potentially leave Boston and for Golden State to say, well, hey, we're not necessarily the tier one contender, but we are a wannabe contender. We're built around a core of, Steph Curry, Jimmy Butler, Draymond Green, all 35 plus years of age. And they're also in a position, unlike other contenders, where they can say to Al Horford, well, hey, we do have a prominent role here for you. You've averaged at least 26 minutes a game, basically throughout his entire career, or at least throughout the last 10 to 15 years, essentially. And we can maintain that. I think there's a lot of contenders around the league that would say, yeah, we'll have you, but we can't promise you that amount of playing time. The Warriors could not only promise him that amount of playing time potentially, but also have the opportunity for a starting role and potentially use that as an incentive to sign Al Horford in free agency. And again, might not necessarily be a financial thing for him at this point of his career. He's nearly 40 years old. He just tasted championship success last year. I think his primary motivation right now would be to try and help win another title for a team. And I think the Warriors, they do fit that bill in terms of a team that wants to be a contender, in terms of a team that, is crying out for a veteran big man to try and pair with Draymond in the front court. So Al Horford, to me, I know we've spoken about Lopez pretty prominently. Kawakami said that he doesn't think Brook Lopez is going to be the target. Maybe it's Al Horford. Again, if they're looking for some kind of veteran stretch big who can space the floor, who defensively is still capable of switching out onto the perimeter a little bit, who probably shows a little bit more and enough agility where that's a better option for the Warriors in their defensive system than having like a slow-footed guy like Post is or like Lopez is, kind of thing. And then obviously the ability to space the floor with, next to Draymond in the front court. I think Horford's something like 44.6%, 41%, and 36.6% or something in each of the last 3 seasons with the Celtics. So this is a guy that hits the three ball at a very high rate. And again, the Warriors could try and incentivize a starting role, a 26 to 28 minute a night role for Al Horford in free agency. Again, let me know what you guys think about that potential. Before I finish up here, Jaren Jackson Jr. just quickly spoke about him on the podcast episode yesterday, just in regard to a potential move, after the Desmond Bane trade, which I think I remain in a similar thought than what I was yesterday in regard to Desmond Bane. I think it's an overpay from Orlando, but an overpay by the right team. And I actually like the move from a Magic perspective. I think they're in a really good spot with their roster where they can afford to pay a steep price for Desmond Bane. But it seems like from Scotto's reporting that the Bane deal has more come about because of the steep price and the fact that it was probably too much for Memphis to pass up, rather than them looking to retool or rebuild here and potentially move on from Jaren Jackson Jr. and Ja Morant. So in regard to that, Scotto said, for Memphis, trading away Bane weakens the roster on paper, but the move is considered part of a retool, not a rebuild. The draft compensation for Bane was too massive for Memphis to turn down. The Grizzlies will look to create more cap space to renegotiate and extend Jaren Jackson Jr., who's obviously less than $24 million on his deal for next season, but then will be after a huge payday following that, which is obviously going to be a complication for any team that potentially trades for Jaren Jackson Jr. But of course, it sounds like Memphis want to keep him. That doesn't mean that you couldn't overwhelm Memphis with a very enticing offer like the Magic have just done with Bane. And the Warriors are in a position where they could do that. Again, I spoke about the fact that the Warriors' future picks are incredibly valuable and more valuable than many teams around the league, given they've got a 37-year-old Steph Curry, given they've got 35-year-old Jimmy Butler and Draymond Green. Like, you're talking about a 2029 first-round pick that could be available. They could use when Steph's going to be 41 years old, a 2031 pick when Steph's going to be 43 years old at points where he could be either out of the league, obviously retired, or at a very, very diminished position than compared to what he is now, where he's arguably still a top 10 player in the league. So those picks to me are incredibly valuable, particularly if the Warriors are also moving Kaminga, and therefore they're diminishing their young pieces even more than that. Like, if you've got if you're trading away 2029, 2031 picks, and you're losing Kaminga, then the future for the Warriors doesn't look overly bright beyond the next 2 or 3 seasons, depending on obviously what you're trading those picks for. It's exactly why Joe Lacob might just refuse to trade those picks unless it's for genuinely a superstar like Giannis. He'd probably just say, look, I like Jaren Jackson Jr., but is he a player to build around once Steph and Jimmy and Draymond retire? Probably not, as like a 1A kind of guy. And so I think when you're looking at some of these future picks, it might just be a case of the Warriors saying, hey, and I think Joe Lacob, who clearly has an eye to the future in the post-Steph era, I think he's probably just going to say, well, you know what? I'm not going to utilize those picks. I'm not going to trade those picks unless I'm getting Giannis Antetokounmpo or a genuine superstar who I know I can build around post-Steph. Anyway, guys, I think I'm going to finish it up there. Been going for over 25 minutes here. Thank you very much to those of you that have tuned in, to those of you that are tuning in on the podcast feed afterwards. Plenty more to come over the remainder of the week. I might come back and do another live stream after Game 6, potentially. Obviously, the Thunder winning the championship. We'll wait and see. Hopefully, there's a Game 7. Obviously, if there's any huge Warrior news or even just NBA news in general that impacts the Warriors, there could be a KD move here coming up in the next 24, 48 hours. I'll jump back on to cover all of that. If you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel already, that'd be greatly appreciated. Follow me at POC252. That's POK252 on X/Twitter. I'll see you on the next podcast episode or the next live stream. Thanks, guys.